David's life is predictable, almost painfully, so every day is a copy of the last. He wakes up to the same alarm, gets dressed in the same style of clothes, and drives the same route to his office, where he spends 8 hours doing the same tasks. His evenings are no different home. By 6 p.m. dinner from the microwave and the TV on, until he drifts off to sleep. It's an existence that, while monotonous, provides him with a strange sense of comfort. There are no surprises in David's world, and he likes it that way. But one Friday night, everything changes, shattering the calm bubble of his life. It's late. Around 10 p.m., David is sprawled on his couch, a half-empty beer on the coffee table, the TV flashing yet another mindless reality show. His mind is only half paying attention, more focused on his mental countdown to bedtime. Then, his phone rings. The sound cuts through the quiet hum of the TV, and he picks it up without thinking. An unknown number flashes on the screen. He frowns. He never gets calls this late, and certainly not from numbers he doesn't recognize. Annoyed, expecting it to be a telemarketer or wrong number, he answers with a flat hello. A voice, low and raspy, crackles through the phone. I'm inside your house. David freezes, the beer halfway to his lips. What? The voice, calm and deliberate, repeats, I'm inside your house. A cold shiver runs down his spine. He stands, his eyes darting around the room. The living room is empty. Everything looks normal, just as it always does. Heart racing, he checks the front door. Locked. He quickly moves to the windows. Secure, trying to maintain control, he grabs the baseball bat he keeps in the hall closet. It's more for peace of mind than actual protection, but tonight it feels like a lifeline. Clutching the bat, he moves room to room, methodically checking every possible hiding place. Under the bed, behind the shower curtain, inside the closets. Each space is empty, just as he left it, but the feeling of being watched clings to him, heavy and oppressive. He can't shake it. His hands trembling. David dials 911. The operator's voice is calm, a stark contrast to his growing panic. 911, what's your emergency? Someone's in my house, David whispers, trying to keep his voice steady. I just got a call. They said they're inside. The operator stays professional, as if she hears this kind of thing all the time. Stay calm, sir. Make sure all the doors and windows are locked. Find a safe place to hide. Officers are on their way. David nods, though she can't see him. He locks himself in the living room, hiding behind the couch, his bat gripped tightly in his hands. His breathing is shallow, his pulse thudding loudly in his ears. He keeps his eyes glued to the front door, waiting, praying for the police to arrive. Minutes stretch into what feels like hours. The silence is unbearable. Then, suddenly, a knock at the door. It's soft, almost polite at first, like someone just tapping lightly. David's heart stops. His stomach drops as the knocking grows louder, more insistent. Then a whisper through the door. The same voice from the phone. David, I'm here. He grips the bat tighter, sweat beading on his forehead. His instinct is to call 911 again, to beg them to hurry. His hands fumble for his phone, his fingers slick with sweat. He dials, and after a few rings, the familiar voice of the 911 operator answers. But this time it sounds different off. Why haven't you let me in, David? The voice asks, distorted, almost mechanical. David's blood runs cold. His phone slips from his hand and clatters to the floor. This isn't real. It can't be. The voice on the other end isn't supposed to know his name. The knocking at the door turns into pounding now, shaking the very walls of the house. It's relentless, rhythmic, like the person outside knows exactly how to unnerve him. Just when David thinks he's going to lose his mind, his phone rings again. Shaking, he answers without thinking. The same voice, low, raspy, and calm. "I told you, David. I'm already inside." Panic surges through him, and he makes a split-second decision. He's not waiting anymore. He runs for the front door, yanking it open in one frantic motion, ready to bolt into the street, ready to scream for help. But before he can take a step, 2 police officers are standing there, guns drawn, looking just as shocked to see him as he is them. He stumbles backward, breathless, trying to make sense of it all. "There's someone in my house," he shouts. "They said they were inside." The officers exchange glances, and one of them steps inside cautiously, weapon still drawn. They move methodically, searching the house from top to bottom. David waits outside, his body trembling, his mind racing. He watches them go through every room, checking every door, every closet, every possible hiding place. After what feels like an eternity, they return, holstering their guns. "There's no one here," one of the officers says, his voice firm but confused. No sign of forced entry. Everything looks normal. David's mind spins. How could this be happening? He saw no one but the voice on the phone, the knocking. It was all real. It had to be. Desperate, he picks up his phone from the floor, showing the officers the call history. "I called 911, David insists. "Twice, I spoke to someone." The officer looks at the phone, his brow furrowing. "We don't have any record of you calling 911 tonight, sir." David's stomach drops. "What? But..." The officer holds out his hand, cutting him off gently but firmly. "Maybe it was a prank, maybe not. Either way, we're here now. And your house is secure. Try to get some rest. Call us if anything else happens." David watches them leave, his mind still reeling. He shuts the door, locking it behind him. But it feels pointless. As he stares at the empty, quiet house, a chilling realization creeps in. Whoever it was, whatever it was, they weren't lying. They really had been inside. Samantha always felt a sense of security living next to the Mortons, an elderly couple who'd been her neighbors for over a decade. They were the kind of people who made the neighborhood feel safe and stable. Every morning, she'd wave to Mr. Morton as he meticulously trimmed his rose bushes, his hand steady, despite his age, his garden shears clipping with precision. Mrs. Morton, always nearby, would bake cookies, leaving sweet aromas of vanilla and chocolate wafting into Samantha's yard. Sometimes, Mrs. Morton would come over with a plate of freshly baked treats, smiling warmly. Their consistency was a comforting routine, a kind of anchor in an otherwise unpredictable world. Their house, too, was always spotless, the lawn perfectly mowed, the windows shining. Samantha would catch glimpses of them through their open curtains. Mrs. Morton knitting in the living room, Mr. Morton reading the paper, his glasses perched on the tip of his nose. It was like watching the perfect embodiment of domestic peace. But one morning, things were different. As Samantha backed out of her driveway to leave for work, she glanced over at the Mortons' yard. The roses, usually vibrant and full, were drooping their petals, browning at the edges. Mr. Morton's garden tools, his prized collection of vintage clippers and shovels, were scattered haphazardly across the lawn, like he had abandoned them mid-task. Samantha frowned. The Mortons were always so particular about keeping their yard pristine. Maybe they're on vacation. she thought. It didn't sit well with her. But she brushed it off, convincing herself it wasn't her concern. The next morning, the sight was worse. The tools were still there, untouched, but now the newspapers had begun piling up on the porch, one after the other, yellowing in the sun. Samantha's unease grew. The Mortons never let their papers sit outside for more than an hour. Mrs. Morton liked to bring them in with her morning coffee, her floral robe fluttering as she did so. Samantha stood in her kitchen, sipping her own coffee, her eyes fixed on the house next door. She tried to rationalize it. Maybe something had come up. Maybe they were visiting family, but why hadn't they mentioned anything? They usually told her if they were leaving town, asking her to keep an eye on the house. The days crept by, and her nerves frayed as the Mortons' absence stretched longer. On the 5th day, Samantha could no longer ignore the gnawing feeling in her stomach. She had to check in. Grabbing her jacket, she made her way across their yard. The stillness of the house seemed unnatural, like the air itself was holding its breath. She knocked on the front door, the sound echoing too loudly in the quiet neighborhood. No response. She knocked again. Harder. This time, still nothing. Determined, she walked around the house, peering into windows, knocking on them as she passed. The curtains, usually open to let in the sunlight, were drawn tightly shut. The house felt wrong, almost as if it were deliberately closing itself off. As she rounded the back of the house, she noticed something else. There were faint scuff marks in the dirt, leading toward the basement door. It was slightly ajar, just enough to make her heart race. That night, as Samantha lay in bed, trying to shake off the feeling that something terrible had happened, she heard it. At first it was faint, a barely perceptible noise coming from the direction of the Mortons' house. She sat up, straining to hear. Then there it was again. Thuds like something heavy being dragged across the floor. She held her breath, listening intently. The noise stopped only to be replaced by whispers, soft, indistinct but unmistakably human. Samantha's rational mind tried to make sense of it. Maybe it was the wind. Maybe old houses made noises at night. But as the whispers grew louder, more insistent, her anxiety spiked. She grabbed her phone and called the police, her fingers trembling as she explained what she'd heard. When the officers arrived, Samantha watched nervously from her porch as they approached the Mortons' house. They knocked on the door, walked around the perimeter, and then returned to her with casual smiles. "Nothing out of the ordinary, ma'am," one of the officers said. "They probably left in a hurry. Everything looks fine." Samantha nodded, but the words didn't ease her worry. The officers didn't even go inside. How could they be so sure? The next night, it happened again. Only this time, the noises were louder. The thudding now sounded like something or someone was pounding against the floor, and the whispers, they were unmistakably coming from more than one voice. Fear gripped her more intense than the night before. Once again, she called the police, this time pleading for them to do more than just a cursory check. When the officers arrived, they seemed irritated. "It's an old house," one of them said. "Creaks happen, especially at night. You're probably just hearing things." Frustrated and terrified, Samantha knew she couldn't rely on them anymore. The authorities weren't taking her seriously, and she couldn't shake the feeling that something sinister was happening next door. So, the following evening, she decided to take matters into her own hands. She waited until the dead of night, when the neighborhood was cloaked in darkness, and the only sound was the hum of distant traffic. Sneaking out of her house, she crossed the lawn into the Mortons' yard. The grass felt cold and damp under her feet, and the air smelled of decay, a stark contrast to the usual floral scent that had once filled the space. Her heart pounded in her chest as she crouched beside the basement window, her breath visible in the cool night air. With trembling hands, she wiped away the dust on the glass and pressed her face close. Inside, the basement was dimly lit, casting long shadows across the walls. And then she saw them, the Mortons. They were bound to chairs, their bodies slumped and motionless. Their faces were pale, almost ghostly, their eyes wide with terror, their mouths gagged. Samantha's breath caught in her throat, her body frozen in shock. She stumbled backward, her pulse racing. Fumbling with her phone, she tried to call the police once again, her fingers shaking too much to hit the right buttons. But before she could dial, she felt a presence behind her. Cold fingers clamped over her mouth, silencing her scream. She was yanked backward, spun around violently, and forced to look into the cold, calculating eyes of one of the officers from earlier. He smiled a cruel, twisted smile. "We told you not to get involved," he whispered, his voice dripping with menace. Samantha's vision blurred as fear overtook her. She realized too late that the very people she had turned to for help were the ones behind it all. It was supposed to be the best Halloween party of the year. Every year, Lily threw an elaborate bash at her parents' massive old house just outside of town. The house, with its towering Gothic architecture and sprawling, overgrown garden, was the perfect setting for a spooky, atmospheric party. Invitations were exclusive, the decorations top tier, and the entire town knew that if you were missing out. This year, however, something was different. The air around the party felt heavier, darker somehow. But that wasn't enough to stop the excitement. The party was in full swing. Loud music blasted through the house, people danced in elaborate costumes, and drinks flowed freely. Everyone was having a great time. And the first few hours, nothing seemed out of the ordinary. That was until around midnight. Lily, dressed as a vampire queen, was making her rounds ensuring everyone was having fun. The party had spilled into every corner of the house. People were in the kitchen, the living room, and even out on the patio. But as she passed through the crowded living room, something caught her eye. A man dressed in an old-fashioned costume, a long black coat, a top hat, and a mask that covered his face was standing in the corner. He wasn't mingling with the guests, wasn't dancing or drinking. He just stood there, completely still, watching. At first, Lily thought he was just someone trying to be creepy. After all, it was Halloween. But something about him unnerved her. Maybe it was how he didn't interact with anyone, or the way his eyes, barely visible behind the mask, seemed to follow her wherever she went. "Hey, cool costume," she called out, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling. The man didn't respond. He just stood there staring. Lily felt a chill run down her spine. She quickly moved on, trying to forget about him. But the strange man lingered in her mind. Every time she glanced around the room, he was still there in the same corner, unmoving. As the night wore on, people started noticing the man too. Whispers spread through the crowd. "Who invited him? Is he with you? He's kinda creepy, isn't he?" Lily finally had enough. She grabbed her friend Jason, who was dressed as a pirate, and pulled him aside. "Do you know who that guy is?" she asked, nodding toward the corner where the man stood. Jason glanced over, his brow furrowing. "No idea. I thought he was one of your friends." Lily shook her head. "I don't know him. And he's just standing there watching everyone. It's freaking me out." Jason, sensing her discomfort, decided to handle it. "I'll go talk to him. Get him to loosen up, or leave." Lily watched as Jason approached the man. She could see them talking. Or rather, she could see Jason talking. The man didn't move, didn't react. After a few moments, Jason turned back to her, his face pale. He didn't say a word. Jason said, his voice shaky. Just stared at me. Frustrated and creeped out, Lily decided to end it. She marched across the room, her heels clicking loudly against the hardwood floor, and confronted the man herself. Look, I don't know who you are or what your deal is, but if you're not going to enjoy the party, you need to leave. Still, the man didn't speak. He didn't even blink. His silence was unnerving, the air around him cold. Lily had enough. She reached out to push him, but her hand met nothing. The moment her fingers touched his chest, he disappeared, vanished like smoke, dissipating in the air. 1 second he was there, solid and real, and the next he was gone, leaving nothing but an icy chill in his place. Lily staggered back, her breath caught in her throat. The room, once full of laughter and music, fell silent. Everyone had seen it. The whispers grew louder. People looked around, confused and terrified. What the hell just happened? Jason muttered, his face as pale as Lily's. I don't know, Lily stammered. Did you see that? He was real. He was right there. Panic rippled through the crowd. Some guests grabbed their coats and rushed toward the door, not wanting to stay a second longer in the house. Others stood frozen, too stunned to move. But then, as quickly as the fear had spread, the music cut off. The house plunged into darkness, the lights flickering once before dying completely. The only sound was the soft hum of the wind outside and the frantic whispers of the guests. A moment later, the front door slammed shut with a deafening bang. Lily's heart pounded in her chest. What's going on? She shouted, but her voice was swallowed by the thick, oppressive silence. Suddenly, from the back of the room, someone screamed. The sound was sharp and raw, cutting through the darkness like a knife. Panic set in, and people began pushing toward the door, but it wouldn't budge. It was as if it had been locked from the outside. The eerie silence returned, and then a slow, deliberate knock echoed through the house, coming from somewhere deep within the walls. 3 knocks, then silence. Lily's breath caught in her throat as a familiar figure stepped out from the shadows, the man in the mask. Except this time, his figure wasn't distant or quiet. He was standing at the center of the room, his eyes glowing behind the mask, his presence suffocating. I never left, he whispered, his voice soft but chilling. Suddenly, the candles flickered back to life, illuminating the room in a dim, ghostly glow. But something was wrong. The guests began to notice people were missing. And the dim light spaces where their friends had stood just moments before were now empty. Lily's breath came in ragged gasps. What is this? Who are you? The man's smile, though hidden behind the mask, was palpable. He took a step forward, and as he did, the lights flickered once again, casting dancing shadows across the room. You shouldn't have invited me, he said, his voice barely a whisper. Before anyone could react, the lights went out completely, plunging the house into total darkness once again. And this time, when they came back on, Lily found herself standing completely alone.